Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. On today's episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill is going to talk about phosphorus and everything to do with phosphorus.
Thank you, Dylan. We're going to talk about phosphorus today, and I like to call it the misunderstood nutrient, and I'll explain how we get to that name that I've applied to phosphorus. You know, if you normally look at most fertilizers, at fertilizer recommendations, they always talk about N, P, and K, and a lot of these nutrients are really based on the order that you need to have them in the soil or the plant needs to have them. So that's why nitrogen's always first. And then we come in with phosphorus, and we're going to talk a lot about phosphorus. I don't want you to think that today will be everything you ever need to know about phosphate, but we will get you hopefully on phosphorus today and get you to understand it's really, really an essential nutrient. Even though there may not be a high percentage in the plant, we're looking at maybe only no more than a half a pound of every 100 pounds that your plant weighs is what you have in the terms of phosphorus into that plant. So it's not a lot in the plant, but it's so important for the functions that it makes the plant work for us. So I'm going to start a little bit off with what I like, because as I think it's an underutilized fertilizer, and as a nutrient in that fertilizer mixture, a lot of times it's miscast, meaning maybe applied at the wrong time, or it might be applied in the wrong space or under the wrong conditions. And so when you don't see any response, you say, well, that stuff doesn't work, and you go away from it and you don't come back to it. But phosphorus initially, and one of the things that most every agronomist knows for sure, that it really is necessary for good root development. Those roots are just seeking out phosphorus, and they've got plenty of videos and pictures where our roots have been stimulated by picking up some phosphorus, and they just proliferate right around that phosphorus once they find it and get it. It basically is able to find it and incorporate it into the roots, which then are moved up the plant, and the plant then is able to utilize it for the rest of its biological processes that it needs.
Now Bill's going to talk about why it's important to have phosphorus for enzymes.
It's also necessary for some enzymes, critical enzymes. I'm not going to go through a list of them, but there's several of them that it's necessary for those enzymes to be activated. So you have enough fertilizer, or you have enough nutrients or enough nutrition in those roots that manufacture those enzymes. But without phosphorus, they aren't activated so that those enzymes do what they're intended to do, which is stimulate this plant to do things in the presence of this enzyme, and allows other things to happen when that enzyme's in place and activated. It's really important you understand it's not that the plant can't make the enzyme, but it'll sit there dormant and not be valuable or not be utilized by the plant unless it's activated. And it's also necessary for the assimilation of carbohydrates and fats. So energy and storage units, you need to have that to be assimilated into the plant, and it takes phosphorus to do that. And then one of the things, it's necessary for the two of the main functions of plant, which is it's necessary for photosynthesis, the taking of carbon dioxide with water and making sugar, and then gassing back off oxygen back into the atmosphere. That simple act is what makes plants so necessary for not only its own biological function, but also to remove a lot of carbon dioxide from out of our air and restore it with straight oxygen.
Now Bill's going to talk a little bit more about respiration.
And one thing that's kind of I want to say that people don't recognize how valuable this is. but it's necessary for what we call respiration. And respiration, to put it simply, just means you're going to take the sugar that photosynthesis makes and you're going to turn it into calories or energy, much the same way that we consume food in terms of calories. We don't really consume calories. We consume that food and its components, and then what the body does with it is it breaks it down and puts it into a digestive cycle. It's able then to actually take those and turn them into calories or energy modules that allow us to function. And plants are much the same way, only much, much higher need for these calories that it takes to burn and do all of its metabolic processes. One of the things that, if you just look at phosphorus by itself, it's always going to be, when it's in the soil, it's always going to be bonded up with some kind of hydrogen. By itself, it's a triple negative, which means it's a very, very, very strong anion that likes to pull any positively charged molecule or element like a calcium, because it has a great affinity for calcium. And basically what it does is it makes itself neutral, puts that calcium on that, 2 of the 3, and hydrogen on the other positive. And so what we get then is a nice stable, very, very stable, and really not very available phosphorus for the plant.
Now Bill's going to explain how to get the phosphorus out of the plant.
So how do we get that phosphorus to get out of that plant? There's numerous ways to do that. One, usually to get calcium and phosphorus to break apart, you're going to need an acidic environment. And so this is like catch-22. One of the things that happens is that when you get our pH too low, phosphorus becomes less available. Well, you would think, it dissolves the calcium off and spurs phosphate to be released, and they're available, but the plants do not want to pick them up, usually because to get to that acidic environment, something's got to be missing. When I say something's got to be missing, once you get to below about a 6.5, every tenth of a point you go below that, you're adding more and more and more hydrogen. And when you add more and more hydrogen, something else has to move off that soil colloid. If you'll remember about when we talked about soil colloids earlier, how they're always in flux of some things being added, some things being taken off. But the more and more acidic we become, something's got to be missing. And primarily what that is calcium. So when calcium is missing, the first thing you'll find is you don't have as much air in your soil, so your microbiology slows down. And you've heard me talk about how important microbiology is in the scheme of things. And we will have long time discussions about what essentially drives everything in the soil is the microbiology. So when you take and decrease its environment by getting very, very acidic, things don't like to be taken up nearly as well. And so the biological activity in that soil goes down when it gets to be very acidic. So we need to actually take that acidity and bring it back up to a more neutral, somewhere around 6 to 7. And then at that point, the phosphate becomes more available.
Now Bill's going to talk about how you can know you have enough phosphorus in your soil.
So when you look at phosphate, one of the things, of course, I would tell you is, how do I know I have enough? And how do I know if it's available? And of course, what am I going to tell you? I'm going to tell you you have to have a soil test to be able to understand what I have to have and how much and what is that number I need and what's the ideal, what's the minimum, what's the ideal, what's too much. That's why phosphate is very misunderstood. A lot of people, we get a good phosphate response, so we just keep putting it on until we don't get one anymore. So you can actually get way too much phosphorus, and we'll talk to you a little bit later about what this phosphate, when it gets too high, the things it does that aren't really desirable. So when you do a phosphate test, my personal favorite is a water pH. And when you do that, you basically do what we call in the soil business a P1 test. And that's a water-soluble test to see what is available out of that, what phosphorus is available to the plant for the coming year. The other one that is also goes hand in hand with it is you need a P2 test to basically, which is also known as an Olsen test, for when the pH gets too high. Because when the pH gets too high, your water pH is not effective. And so because it's not effective, it doesn't give you a reading of what's available. So we really can't make good recommendations or understand do we need phosphate or not until we know where we fall. Okay? So we'll start with the P1. There are minimum levels that you need to have. And on a normal water pH using the P1, what you need is somewhere around at least about 300 to 350 pounds. That to me is the baseline. You need to get to that. And if you don't have it, you need to add phosphate to your soil so we can get up to that so everything begins to work better. Now, when you don't have that much, there are a few things you can do, but primarily for the long-term health of the soil, you're going to need to add some. And we'll talk about some of the products you can use and why some work and why some are nice analysis, but that's all they are. They don't really work in the soil nearly as well. So ideally, you'd like to get to at least 300. When you get up to 500, you're in pretty much an excellent spot. So the sweet spot is above 500. It'll give you your best yields usually. It'll get the most amount of phosphorus into the plant that you need. It'll fill all these needs of respiration, photosynthesis, these enzyme activations. It does all those things we talked about, okay? And you need to be up to about 500 pounds per acre. That's what the 500 would mean. That gives you a number of the available phosphorus that you can count on for 1 year. Doesn't mean the plant will take it all up. Just means we need that much for it to be plentiful around the root base to be able to get that picked up. When you get above 500, it's still just fine up until the fact you get up to about 750. So the sweet spot's between 500 and 750. I used to always shoot for 750, but what I found is I like to leave some room. So I like to get to 550, no more than 600, because down the road, if you find a place that you want to put some compost or manures, I don't want to be bumping up at the top of excellent, which is 750 pounds. I want to give me some latitude to be able to add those products at the same time not being able to go over that. Because once you get above that level, that excellent level, you start to block nutrients. They're antagonistic. Particularly, the one that comes to mind most often is when you get high phosphates, meaning above 800 to 1,000 and then beyond. I've seen phosphates at unbelievable levels. And what happens is it blocks out the available zinc. So everybody sees a zinc deficiency, and it's very difficult to satisfy the zinc at the plant when you understand it's low of zinc and you can't get it into the plant. A lot of times there's plenty of zinc in the soil, beyond excellent levels, but the plant can't take it up because the phosphate's dominating it so much higher than it needs to be that it blocks out zinc. Also blocks out copper, and copper is that natural fungicide that plants like to have, and it also helps the resiliency in times of hot and cold weather. It also gives resiliency for bending of tissue but not breaking, gives it flexibility. So it has lots of other good uses of copper.
Now Bill's going to talk about why it's not good to have too much phosphorus.
But the thing about phosphates is that it's the age-old thing. A little's good, and a lot, when we get too much, creates all kinds of problems. Most of the problems that you see are generally derived from things where you're putting on a lot of organic material like manures and lots of compost, where people are putting out tons and tons of compost, and they're putting out lots and lots of manure year after year, more than the plant actually needs and more than the plant can remove. Remember, I said we're only taking out about a half a pound for every 100 pounds. So if I'm adding 100, 200 pounds, I'm adding a lot of phosphate that the plant's not going to be able to pick up because it doesn't need that much. And so what we do is we get out of balance. Everything in soil is about balance, balancing things so that they are the right amount. And that's what good soil tests tell you. Here's where I need to be, balancing all my nutrition, and then my crop is happy because it's got everything in the amount that it needs to be its most successful.
Now Bill's going to talk about why phosphate is so important for respiration.
The other thing about phosphate that is it's really hard for people sometimes to understand this concept. So I'll try to explain it as best I can. When a plant cannot get enough phosphate, it needs more phosphate, and it can't get enough. And one of the reasons that it needs it is to run its respiration. There's a couple compounds that it needs to run what we call the Krebs cycle. And in this Krebs cycle, if it doesn't have enough phosphate, it can't produce adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate. And without those two compounds, it cannot convert sugar into calories. So if we keep shoving more and more calories into the system, the plant's going to shut down. It cannot do what it needs to do. So what the plant does to react to having not enough phosphate, it begins to slow the plant down. And it does it by having smaller leaf surface. So what's that do? Well, smaller leaf surface basically makes that tree not be able to photosynthesize as much because it has less chloroplast in that leaf because it's a smaller leaf. And so what happens is it's like taking an engine and a carburetor and keep choking the carburetor down until the motor can handle the amount of gas you're trying to give it. If it just keeps flooding out, the car can't run. So you choke it down into the point where you give it exactly what that motor is able to run. And it's like running this cycle like a motor. It's a cycle that runs and turns out lots and lots of energy in the form of calories from the Krebs cycle. So when you don't have that phosphate, it slows the plant down. You can tell by looking at your leaf surface. A lot of times on tree crops, there's a lot smaller leaves, and you wonder why that is. One of the things that most people will tell you is, well, that can't be because I took tissues, and my tissues say the level of phosphate in my tissues is good to very good. But yes, the percentage is because the plant reacts and keeps the right percentage in the leaves that it does grow, or the leaves that do grow, by giving it just the amount of phosphate that it needs to run these reactions. And that always is somewhere around 0.2, maybe up to 0.25%. And that's pretty high. A lot of times it'll be down at 0.14 to 0.18. But all of these are really acceptable numbers. The problem is that you don't have the mass. You don't have as big a canopy. You have smaller leaves, so you have not near as much of an engine to drive and maximize production. Some things like corn crop actually give you off other signs. They'll be either a brown or a purpling of the leaves. By the time you see those, it's too late. You're not going to be able to change it and get back to where you want to get. It's like once you've fallen behind on this race, the plant's already determined we're not going to get this big, and we're going to slow down, and we're going to grow a smaller crop where we don't have the needs of as many calories, as much energy, and so we just slow down. So this is one thing that a lot of people always judge adequate phosphorus off of their tissue test, and it is not a good place to find that out. You might find an extreme deficiency with a tissue, but you'll never really find out that you have enough. You have to look at what that plant's doing, how big are the leaves, and how well is it growing, and then using that into your production. One of the other interesting things about phosphorus that, there's a lot of things like, of course, if you over apply nitrogen, as it becomes nitrate, it gets leached out, which is not a good thing, but it will leach, and you won't just continue to build up more and more and more nitrogen. Same thing with things like sulfur. You won't continue to build up more and more and more of it. What you have to do with phosphate, literally, is you have to grow it out. So if you can imagine, we're not using a lot, utilizing, and when I say using it, basically putting it into your plant and removing it from the soil takes a long time. Once you get to these high numbers of 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of phosphorus, it takes a lot of time for you to get back to that point where it will pull it down into those great levels of 5 to 750. So as you're getting it up to that 500 level, be careful that you're not just continuing to rise up with that number higher and higher. The other thing is there's a lot of phosphate products out there. A lot of them have been used by the fertilizer industry for years and years. And part of my job years ago was to run a fertilizer plant, manufacture some liquids and put together dry blends and those kind of things in that. Fertilizer companies, jobs that we were tasked with doing, and putting out more of a prescription type of fertilizer out into the field.
Now Bill's going to talk about fertilizers and phosphates.
One of the first things you want to know is that all fertilizers aren't created equal, particularly on phosphates. This is one that we want to really dig into a little bit. There's a lot of phosphates out there that are called single supers or triple super phosphorus, and they're like O20O and O46O. And one of the things about them is that they're very, very acidic. They're down about a 4.4. Well, we already know that that's not a good place to be for phosphorus. It doesn't like to be taken up, and so we like to get closer to that sweet spot around 6 to 6.5. So that again is a bad place to start. But once you get out of that pH range, it becomes less and less available, and it becomes more and more tied up, and more problems for the plant to actually pick that up and be successful. So something that's much better and will actually build phosphate over time is things like diammonium phosphate or monoammonium phosphate, or what we see in the trade as 1846, which is a diammonium, or 1152O, which is a monoammonium. And those will build phosphates because they're not in these low pH. They've been run through some processes running anhydrous ammonia with phosphoric acid, and this is kind of some of the things that you can get out, these products that you get out, make them dry products out of it. And with that in mind, those are good building blocks. There's a lot of liquids out there and a lot of irrigation systems that love to inject into their system, but kind of the fallback one is 1034O, which has been around, polyphosphate, as we'd call them. And they've been around for a long time. Not the best phosphate, but they will build phosphate levels over time. One of the things you'll find, though, is to put them into that, and again, that's definitely an anhydrous reacted with phosphoric acid and then cooled, and your responding product you get is this 1034O, which is a building block for a lot of liquids. That's a pretty green color that comes out of it. It's a very reactive material when it gets around phosphorus particularly, so it becomes somewhat maybe a little bit hard to work with. But what we're seeing in the industry today, which are some of the real Cadillac products, which are kind of a nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium blend with the main nutrient being phosphorus, like a 924-3 or an 824-4, and there's all kinds of other mixtures that you can put together. But most of them are chelated in such a way so they don't get tied up, but they're very expensive. So we have to use them judiciously. What I like to do is, if you're going to do it over the long term, is use them temporarily in the front end because you can use a lot less of them. You can use them a lot in starters to make sure you get your plant off to a good start, because there isn't any seeded crop that won't do better if it can get into starter phosphate just as that seed, basically germinates, gets into phosphate, and basically starts to grow. It always does better with starter phosphate, regardless of how much you have in your soil. Phosphate is very, very necessary to get things off to a good start. You get those roots stimulated, they'll get deep rooted, they'll give you better anchorage. There's just so many things that phosphorus needs, and plants react very reactive to that because they see that, and you can see root flushes right around the phosphate that they found. So if you look down say you're planting corn, you plant corn and you have a starter fertilizer. If you break that away and look down, you'll see just a tremendous root proliferation right around where you put that starter phosphate. It's really amazing how it knows what it needs, and once it gets there, it responds very, very well. But it's one of the things about having low phosphorus in your soil is it becomes more difficult for your roots to find it. Those phosphates, because they're very stable and tied up, don't move through mass flow to the roots. The roots have to move to the phosphate. And because they have to move, once they find it, then they begin to, have a root flush around that and start to break it down and take it into the plant. And it just stimulates it to do more and more root growth right around that area. That's why once you get up to this number around 500 to 750, there's lots of it hanging around in a lot of different areas, so the plant has an easier time getting into it. When you have less, it's just a little bit here all over, and there's more areas that the plants can grow. They don't have sonar where they can say, well, there it is, and they grow right to it. They just kind of run into it by accident, but once they run into it, find it, process it, then the plant understands that that's where the phosphate is, and it goes after it pretty heavily. Phosphorus, again, has so many functions, and I've talked a little bit about it, and there'll be several other times through other podcasts where I'll just bring some other anecdotes about phosphorus, because it's one of the things I think that we tend not to use and utilize phosphate in the way that we do. There's a lot of phosphate that's out there, and I talked about a few. There's some other good phosphates that are available to put in through composts and manures. Those are another good source to build phosphate if you have it available. But you got to know what's in it. You have to have an analysis on your crop or on your compost or manure, so when I add a ton of this material, I'm going to add this many pounds of phosphate. Okay, and I use the terms phosphorus and phosphate kind of intertwined. Phosphorus is kind of the element, and phosphate is really what the plant's going to take up. And so you'll hear me talk, like I say, a lot about phosphate, and it's what I usually use when I'm talking about the phosphorus forms that we have. I just kind of wrap this up a little bit, and there's a lot, like I say. I felt like I know there's a lot of things I want to talk about later on phosphate. This is just like a beginning primer as I'm trying to go through all the nutrients one by one, getting you to understand the differences of all the needs the plant has and what those needs are, where they're derived from. But phosphorus, as I said earlier, is one of those essential ones. Even though it isn't taken up in the same way that in terms of volume that a nitrogen or even a potassium or calcium or magnesium, what it does need, it needs that amount to be able to do all of the metabolic processes. So it's a reason it's the second nutrient in a fertilizer analysis. That P does so many things, and hopefully you've heard a little bit about it. We'll talk more about it in future podcasts when we're kind of putting what I call the interaction of these nutrients together. Right now we're just kind of taking one out by itself, talking a little bit about it, and then we talk about how we can utilize it, how we can build it in the soil, how much it would take, how all of those things enter into it. But once we get into the entire fertility program, a lot of it's the little the little interactions that we get. I talked a little about the negative reactions. So I did mention that phosphate would block out zinc uptake. Well, if you get zinc really high and you're low of phosphate, that zinc will block out phosphate uptake. So sometimes they are so antagonistic that if they're both low, you have to bring them up equally at the same time. Bring this up a little, bring the zinc up, bring the phosphate up, kind of in sync. Or if one's really high, we've got to work on it faster, and then we work on a few other things if we can't get enough built up in the soil because of economics, and that's very important because phosphates are not cheap, is that we can also then take and add in some of these really expensive ones, but just a few gallons to give it enough phosphate to get to the plant growth levels that we want. And the other places it's phosphates, and also some things chelated with some of these phosphates are very good foliars to make, kind of give it that little extra that we may need to make it maximum production. So for today, we're going to end it there on phosphates. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about it. Be careful because soil tests, if you don't know what you're looking for, tissue test, if you don't know what you're looking for, they can mislead you as to you thinking you have enough phosphorus when in fact you are well short. And if you're well short, you will never be able to produce the kind of crops you want to produce if you don't have enough available phosphate. Thanks for today. We'll talk to you soon.
And thank you, Bill, for another awesome episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell talking about phosphorus. Make sure to stay tuned in for episodes every other week, and also don't forget to leave a comment asking any questions that you might have. Until next time, stay curious.